Hello and welcome. I am live from Pellam's Wasteland, and today I have another episode of Pellam's Wasteland Reads for you guys. This time, another double feature, I guess I would say, of two books that are thematically connected, although they are fairly different structurally, I guess I would say. Um, the first is The Assassination of Julius Caesar, A People's History of Ancient Rome by Michael Parenti, and the second is Augustus by John Williams. The Assassination of Julius Caesar is nonfiction, and it basically covers the era of the late republic, as they often call it. The earliest events that are talked about in detail are the Gracchi brothers, as they have um, gone down in history as populares. Whereas Augustus by John Williams is fiction. It's a novel. It's an epistolary novel, in fact. So the whole of the book is presented as letters or sometimes as documents of other sorts. There are a couple of like historical decrees and things like that that make appearances in sections. But on the whole, it is broadly speaking historical fiction that attempts to um, present historical events, but not with words that have been recorded. And it covers a later period. It starts basically with the assassination of Julius Caesar. Although the book about the assassination of Julius Caesar continues on and covers some of the later events that Augustus gets into, but then covers essentially the entirety of Augustus's life from his time with Julius Caesar while he was still alive, all the way out to the end of his life and um, the ascension of Tiberius as his successor. So, those are the two books that I read recently that I want to talk about. The Assassination of Julius Caesar is quite good, and I'll talk about that one first. I have read a little bit of Michael Parenti. I read at least one other book of his, um, and he definitely has a left leaning and fairly Marxist oriented analysis of history, and that's a lot of what this is about. Um, Basically, the sort of core thesis of the assassination of Julius Caesar is that one of the running through lines of the late Republic has to do with political struggle that is not just between individuals, but is basically between um, very fundamentally different expectations of politics. In the classical sources, we have information about the this idea of the optimates and the populares, and these are the Latin names for these two political parties. Would be an overstatement, but basically two camps. The optimates being basically of the best, and the in by the best they mean essentially the hereditary nobility, or if not necessarily hereditary nobility, the very rich often. Whereas the other side, the other camp, the populares, meaning for the people, basically. In this case, being largely the urban and rural poor. And this is a division that comes down to us from the sources of the time, but also has not always been treated as a major division in more modern sources about this information. And basically, the core thesis of the assassination of Julius Caesar is that the very like obscenely rich senatorial class conspired to kill Julius Caesar, not because of any of these kind of high ideals of um, liberty or political freedoms or anything like that. That really they were upset by Caesar's broad reform programs that would cut into their position of economic and political privilege, and thereby um, essentially change or perhaps even ruin their way of life. Now, in addition to being history about this period, the assassination of Julius Caesar is also essentially historiography. That one of the core themes running through this book has to do not just with what precisely happened in this period of the late Republic, but also the way in which, as Parenti terms them, gentlemen scholars or gentlemen historians have reacted to a lot of the things and have been willing to accept the arguments of especially gentlemen scholars or gentlemen historians from the period fairly wholesale. This argument about a line of reasoning that exists in this particular essentially political and economic class in antiquity that has been largely supported by a similar political and economic class in modernity. So what we get is a fairly consistent overview of many of these struggles between the populares and the optimates. This discussion of what happens, which is largely of members of this populares position being exiled or killed, or all sorts of other horrible things done to them, including but not limited to the assassination of Julius Caesar. Is basically the argument. Um, so we have stuff about the Gracchi brothers or Gracchi brother. I assume you say Gracchi in Latin, but I don't know for certain. Or the Catalan conspiracy, as it's called. Discussion of Cicero in particular, because one of our major sources for the period is the writings of Cicero, which have not all survived, but a lot of them have survived. And Cicero as a sort of emblem of the viewpoints of this particular very, very rich and powerful class of men, because they are overwhelmingly men, um, or at least men who have the power, right? That's sort of the nature of this period. Um, anyway, as compared to what we might with in sort of the argument of the book, a more critical view of the things that have been recorded for us, how we might think about some of the things that are reported, and basically talking about the idea of a number of the political reforms that were proposed, the very overwhelmingly negative response to them from this senatorial and to some degree from the equestrian class as well. Um, their seeming non-effect of the worst type of concerned consequences, that basically that even when these reforms went into place, often they did not have a ruinous effect on these political classes, however much they might have limited some of the immense wealth and power of these people. And by the end, a discussion not just of the assassination of Julius Caesar himself, but also a comparison of the treatment of Julius Caesar as a political figure by the so-called liberators faction, this conspiracy of senators who assassinated him, as opposed to the treatment of Augustus, who himself was something of a political reformer, but had a general, the sort of general assumption being that he had a much lighter hand when it came to a lot of these things. And though he ended up limiting the political power of the senatorial class in a lot of ways by basically being, at the top himself, he was willing to preserve a great many of their privileges, and willing to preserve the illusion of their power in a way that was appeasing, and therefore that basically that they didn't decide to conspire against Augustus in the same way because of the benefits to their political class, um, which is a I I don't know. I suppose it is a little bit of an oversimplification of the Augustan period if Augustus by John Williams is to be believed. But it is, I think, a really interesting argument. It makes a lot of really good points about thinking about the historical sources that have been um, laid down in antiquity and also in modernity, analyzing them for their um, biases and their blind spots and their willingness to alter the truth in convenient ways, and especially of this kind of broad sense of how are we to think about things like class struggle in a period where a lot of that terminology wasn't used nearly as much. And that's sort of one of the kind of core points of the book, aside from all this stuff about what the people actually did, but this broad idea that actually this um, issue that we are probably familiar with today, in part because we have a lot of terminology and discussion that makes it easier to talk specifically about the idea of like political corruption among a specific political class and things like that, which the Romans were aware of, but in part because, for among other things, because literacy and especially writing was so restricted to a small percentage of the population, we just don't have the same type of broad primary sources that we do about events today, and that therefore it can be hard to find evidence for all of these things that we are familiar with today. And the sort of argument goes, well, did people in this time think about things in this way? And this is sort of a historiographic argument because it really gets into trying to think about, well, how do you write history in a period like this where we really only have like one specific political class that has recorded the thoughts and opinions on the events of the period. How do you come to terms with all of that? And the sort of book as a whole as a presentation of here's what you can do to try to understand a period of history that, in the view presented in the book, has one sort of principal viewpoint that has been upheld historically. Now, I don't know how true that is, or it may have been more true. I think this book was published, if I remember correctly, in 2003. My own, especially in college, my own learning about the period involved a lot more of, I think, the things that are in this book that Michael Parenti is getting at, a lot more what I would describe as a more nuanced understanding of the level of political corruption and the level of control and the obscene wealth of the senatorial class and all of those sorts of things that I learned about a lot of that more than many of the sources that are presented in here. And I don't know how much that has to do with my own education having taken place more recently than this book came out. Or maybe I just had professors who were interested in pursuing that line of thought more than others or whatever. I don't know necessarily, but this is, I think, a really interesting way to get at that issue, especially if you do not have a background in what I would describe as a not necessarily alternative position entirely, but a position that takes seriously the hypothesis that we can find evidence of the kind of um, political struggle that we know about in later periods, even where the direct documentary evidence of that type of political concern is not nearly as easy to find. Um, And so that's, I think, why this book is interesting, is that it presents essentially a different set of conclusions about this period than plenty of other um, books about this period. And I will say also that I am not an expert by any means. I know perhaps a little bit more about the late Republic than plenty of other periods of history, or the late Roman Republic than many of those other periods. But you know, I don't have a PhD in Roman history or anything like that. So take everything that I'm saying with a grain of salt, I guess. Um, and one source of those grains of salt might be Augustus by John Williams, which is like I said, it's fiction, so it does not record the specific words of most of the people, although there are a couple of bits of it that are actually from things that have come down to us from the period. So, like, there's small excerpts from things like the Res Gestae that are, how much that is actually what Augustus wrote and how much that's specifically for the purposes of, making a political point is a discussion that is worth having among historians. But that's sort of the point of the book, is this um, ultimate unknowability of power. Basically, it's a story that has to do with this kind of starting period of civil war, of working through Augustus and his kind of pack of buddies trying to deal with the aftermath of the assassination of Julius Caesar and the war against the liberators, and then eventually the second stage of that civil war against Mark Antony and Cleopatra, and then culminating in the Battle of Actium. And at the end of it, Augustus is left as basically the most powerful man in the most powerful state in the Mediterranean. And then it also takes on a really interesting character because, of course, like a great many books that are about seizing power, a lot of the book is not just about seizing power, but about um, wielding it after having seized it. And so a good chunk of the book after the period about the civil wars is basically about Augustus trying to control the empire, his various struggles with all sorts of different power players. One consistent theme is that because he was fairly sickly, he would get sick, and everybody would think, well, this is the end, and we need to make preparations for what will be essentially the next stage of the Principate, um, or perhaps what whatever else might happen if he dies, and then Augustus gets better, which is um, in some ways lucky for his his own project, but also comes to be sort of a problem as all of the men that he has picked out to be his successor keep dying off, because he has lived so long, until eventually he is left with his stepson Tiberius. Um, and we get into the shift from the Julians to the Claudians when they talk about the Julio Claudians. Um, anyway, but the book is really, really good. This is I think all of the John Williams books are great. I've read all of them by now. Stoner and Butcher's Crossing and Augustus. I think Augustus might be my favorite, but it's also been a couple of years since I read Stoner or Butcher's Crossing. So probably the most honest answer is that my favorite is whichever of them that I have read most recently. Um, but this is really absolutely kind of top tier fiction, about all of these fascinating characters, and that really gets into all of these issues of history, but is not kind of, I mean, it's not like a textbook for anybody who is worried about that, but it also, I think, doesn't present a simplistic view of history that is um, easy to get into for the purposes of narrative. That this is a book that is very much about these characters who are difficult and have all of these difficulties interacting with each other, and are just so wonderfully realized across all of these different little snippets of text, all of them having kind of their own different positions and biases and all that sort of stuff that comes across in their own stories, but also in the way that they interact with people. And there are more than a few places where we get to see essentially multiple viewpoints of the same event. There's a great sequence I mentioned, little bits from the Res Gestae, but there's a sequence kind of fairly early on where we've had 30 or 40 pages of talking about the prescriptions of the Second Triumvirate and the you know immense amount of controlled political violence that has gone on, that has really gotten a lot of characters that we might recognize, and all of this, the kind of atmosphere of fear and violence, and all of this that has been kind of so grim and dark. And then the kind of bit of text that caps it off is like two sentences from the Res Gestae that is Augustus saying, when I came to Rome as a young man, I found it riven by faction and political violence, and so I seized control of the state in order that the Roman people would no longer be oppressed by these issues. And it's so like just kind of brutally condensed, and such a kind of fascinating restatement of all of the things that we'd be getting into, and really totally gets into what the book is about more than anything, which, like I said, it's this kind of meditation on power and the illusions of power and the kind of unknowability of people, but especially of the way that kind of power forces this unknowability, the way that Augustus is um, by necessity forced into becoming this kind of strange political enigma that is able to take advantage of the chaos around him, and is able to do all of these different things in order to kind of fulfill his long-term goals of transforming and stabilizing the Roman state. Um, and it's also, it's just so heartbreaking. The sequences, the kind of last, I don't know, third of the book or so are largely about Julia, Augustus's daughter, who has been a major player for basically all of the second half of the book, um, and Augustus himself. And it's so heartbreaking, and really just beautifully realized fiction that will make you sad, because the things that are happening are sad. And of course, the things that happened historically are sad, but sometimes it helps to have it be fiction that can get into those things a little differently. And I think that's part of why I like this book so much, is because it really represents a, a kind of fascinating endeavor of figuring out how to transform history into something that is still historical, but is also art, and is, yeah, that's what it is about in a lot of ways. Which is really good. This is a strong recommend from me. Augustus by John Williams. It's really, really good. The cover that I've got up on screen is the NYRB Classics one. All three of the novels by John Williams have NYRB Classics re-releases, but then they also, I think, all have maybe reprintings by Vintage. I don't remember for certain. So not that hard to find anymore, luckily. And yeah, won, I think, the National Book Award in 1972, if I remember correctly. Anyway, Augustus is really, really good. You should go read it if you have a chance. But yeah, that is going to be it for me for today. Hope you check out either or both of those books. They're both quite good. If you're at all interested in the period of the late Republic, early Empire of Rome. And yeah, so like I said, check them out if you have a chance. And otherwise, I've been live from Pellam's Wasteland, and I will see you next time. Take care, everybody.